Well, good. Thank you, Sam. I fully reciprocated. Sam's one of the most capable people I've ever worked with. It's been a true pleasure and honor to work with her and Danae and the rest of the folks on Teresa's fabulous team here in Philadelphia. It's truly an honor for me, not a burden by any means whatsoever. So thank you. It's great to be here. So just to be clear, I don't start with Senator Casey until Tuesday. Okay. And so I am not here representing him in any way. I also am not with the Fed anymore after being there 11 and a half years. So I'm in this rare moment where I'm not on the payroll of a publicly funded institution. But I am pleased to wear my Aspen hat, where I've been for 5 years and with whom I was very honored to publish the book that came out about a year ago. So I don't know about you, Darrick, but I was very inspired and indeed challenged by what we've heard so far. You all set a very high bar. Thank you very much for your comments. And it's greatly going to inform what we talk about today. So I have the pleasure and honor of sharing a stage with Darrick again. I can't tell you how much Darrick has shaped my own thinking and informed the work, not just of me, but of the Federal Reserve System about how we think about the racial wealth gap. And I'm not saying this gratuitously. He literally changed the way we thought about this work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we get started, Darrick, let the room know who Darrick Hamilton is. Like, where'd you come from and where'd you go to school and how'd you end up working on the racial wealth gap?
Well, my sister used to tease me and say I came from the garbage can. Now, I'm going to start with gratitude also and say, Ray, it is an honor and privilege and pleasure to be on stage with you. I might get a little emotional saying it because you invoke integrity, the ability to be able to convince and change someone or change someone's perspective and think about things in a different way. That's what we want. We want to be able to learn and grow and have views informed by evidence as well as emotion and pursue different paths. So that means a lot. Gratitude also to Teresa in the back. Gratitude to Sam. Lots of people in this room, I can take the whole time, but I am going to point out my co-author, Naomi, who is a rising star. She's a star. So another, Anne, and then Chris Henderson in the back. Chris Henderson is at the Federal Reserve. Chris was a year ahead of me in graduate school. And when you talk about community and the power of community, it was a godsend that I went to that program and had the privilege and honor to be with Chris and grow with Chris. And our friendship will always be there for a long time. I know Lisa Servine is here. She was the dean that presided over my tenure case. So in addition to being my friend, thank you for. So who is Darrick? I'll say this, it's cliche, but it drives home the point. Tale of two cities. I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I had parents that cared a lot about my well-being, my sister's well-being, so much so that they put us into an elite private school, Brooklyn Friends School, that probably is defining for me. It gave me an ethical as well as rigorous approach to understanding I'm driven by passion, which is why I might get choked up a little bit. I say tale of two cities, but I also say that oftentimes a narrative like mine gets used in a way to talk about what the power of effort, hard work can achieve. But the opposite occurred. A narrative of mine can also, the true reality is one of tragedy, because I lost my parents. And I lost them in part because of the stress, the stigma, and the effort for their children to have pathways to do better than they did. Wasn't my choice. The PhD versus my parents, I might have made a different choice. But the goal is to create work and pathways so that people don't have to make those tragic choices in their lives. That's the ideal. That's what we're working for.
Darrick, I want to just give you a moment to reflect on what we heard in the previous panels about narratives, about framing. Again, I feel inspired. I feel challenged. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the room?
I think thus far the program has been put together in such a robust, informative way. We began with some policies. We began with structures. We also began with history. It's also important to understand that analytical understandings devoid of history is inadequate. But we also had a lot of work done on narratives. Three things that are inseparable and iteratively related. And if we don't get them, we'll never get policy structures right. And that is economics, politics, and the ways in which we sort individuals into identity groups and stratify based on those identity groups. All three have always been related throughout history, throughout space, and throughout time. And it's useful to understand that if we want to pursue pathways towards justice. Policies, economics, Anne was right. Economics is largely, markets are political constructions. Markets are political constructions. There are some tendencies that happen, structures and forces that happen, but we actually get to define markets. We actually get to define our economy. We do have choice in doing that. Politics are very much related to narratives, very much related to the ways in which we want to organize and structure and define well-being. And sadly, throughout history, we have separated groups based on cursory identities like race, gender, nativity. You like blue things, I like green things, whatever it is, in ways that have been hierarchical. We have weaponized the ability to divide people in ways that create consolidation at the top. So I'll say this real quick. How is it in a democracy that economic and political power is able to consolidate in perpetuity for a long time? Why won't a dominant political group create a different structure? Here's where race comes in. The ability to offer a dominant political group relative status, unfortunately, permits systems where we can have consolidation at the top. In other words, as inequality grows, relative status has more saliency. So however bad your lot in life may be, at least you're not them. Not only does that have psychological appeal, it also has material appeal. We see in economic downturns, the desire not to be the first fired, and then in economic upswings, the desire to be the first hired, it has material consequences. So, I will take a little exception with the notion that it's all, it's not zero sum, property rights and whiteness is necessarily bad for us all. If we want to get to a society without racism, white people will have to give something up. And that is the privilege associated with not being the first fired or the last hired or the first fired. What else does it mean? What gets exchanged? Now, of course, some people in the room will say, well, if we had coalitions across identity groups, we would have greater power at the low end to fight structures in which there's consolidation at the top. And that's true. But it is weighed against relative status, which also offers material and psychological benefits. So it is not clear that it necessarily does. However, if we redefine well-being in more moralistic terms, which are just as human as our self-interested desire to accumulate, if we redefine humanity into things that might seem hokey, but I dare say are human, shared prosperity and sustainability and fairness and justice. If we redefine economics in those terms, then it is unambiguous that the type of conversation we're going to have is good for all people and all society.
Very powerful. Thank you, Darrick. So I want to follow the rules that Sam set out for me, which is to focus a little more on solutions, and I want to transition a little bit to that. So I share your view, Darrick, that in order to narrow the racial wealth gap, and believe me, after hearing Ann, I understand that that's not necessarily the best word, but for the moment, we have large and enduring gaps. My colleague, Anna Hernandez-Kent, who's here, and Lowell Ricketts at the St. Louis Fed, I should say my former colleagues, have documented profound and enduring racial wealth gaps. And that's, of course, building on the work that Duran and Court and others have documented as well. To really narrow those gaps, you've said, Darrick, and I share this view, that we have to look retrospectively, currently, and prospectively to really make a meaningful impact on the gap. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that, and what might be some one or two solutions in each of those areas?
Yeah, harping back again on what Ann said earlier about the role of politics in our framing. Well, we have a society that double downs on property rights. We have a lot of view that part of our development and pathways towards growth and prosperity are related to us getting our property rights right. What is problematic is if we understand property rights without understanding the manner and path by which that property came to be distributed in the first place, that's a problem. It's dishonest. Another pathway or another type of rights that we are advocating for is economic rights. That simply being a human being entitles you to a base level of resources so that you can thrive. There are a set amount of goods and services, and we can name them: a job, healthcare, some modicum of capital, some modicum of access to an account in the 21st century, education, without which people don't have ability to reap the rewards from their ingenuity or their effort. So in a capitalist or a socialist framing, irregardless of ideology, there is a necessary amount of resources people need in order to engage in transaction. So to me, that's an economic rights framing. You can have, society may organize itself in many ways, but economic rights are essential. Otherwise, you're at the whim of charity in the transaction, or you're at the vulnerability of exploitation. If we take these things to be true, and I dare challenge somebody to tell me they're not true. They can, but I think I'm right about that. Then it becomes useful to frame our society. So Ray, I'm giving you longer-winded answers than I think you intended, but basically, for pathways of justice, we need a retrospective approach to redress and acknowledge that past. And acknowledgement is important for a lot of the political dimensions. If we want to have prospective policies that are not framed in those that are at the low end being deficient in some way, because our current structure that emphasizes markets as the efficient, fair, colorblind distributor, devoid of a notion of power, devoid of a notion of resources, it naturalizes poverty, right? It naturalizes us into thinking that the reason these people are doing poorly and these people are doing well is there must be some deficiency or some inadequacy with the population that's not doing well. So an honest reckoning of our history helps change those narratives. An honest reckoning of our history lets us ground poverty and inequality in what it actually is grounded in, which is resource deprivation. And that creates pathways for forward-looking policies where we can actually get it better and do it right. But when you ask the question retrospective, and I know a lot of people in the room are probably thinking, well, if we're thinking about racial inequality, what about reparations? And the answer is yes. and the answer is yes for two reasons. Acknowledgement, again, that acknowledgement does more than benefit Black people. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of poor white people that get racialized as well, right? These narratives extend well beyond Black people. J.D. Vance is going to be the next senator in Ohio. J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, basically, he is pathologizing white populations in the same way Black populations have been pathologized. is that the right word? Pathologize. Thank you. Right. So I guess that retrospective, honest reckoning, which would come along with reparations, is valuable not just for Black people, but society. Then there's the redress, the specific redress. Naomi and I wrote a paper in your book that points out that, look at South Africa. They had the Truth and Reconciliation. They had the acknowledgement. That was valuable for a peaceful transition. You have now Black elite people, largely through political regress, who have high levels of well-being. However, structurally, they're just as unequal as they were post-apartheid. They didn't have the redress, right? The ways in which you have to redress large inequalities is through capital. The way wealth is built, wealth begets more wealth. So it's a necessary ingredient to redress wealth is going to be not just political modifications, but also literally that capital. So reparations is not enough, though. Why is reparations not enough? Because what does wealth do? Like I said, wealth begets more wealth. So even reckoning with that past and getting things right from a moral, economic, and just perspective, going forward without some either automatic stabilizer or some other policy, wealth will do what it does best. It will consolidate, it will iterate, and some people will have and some people will have not. So in our system, again, regardless of ideology, capitalism or socialism, we need a policy, an automatic stabilizer that ensures that people, as part of your existence, you have access to capital so that you actually have some ability to compete in transaction without vulnerability to exploitation or whims of charity.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. So I want to go back to some research that Anna and Lowell and my former colleague, Bill Emmons, did at the symposium that you participated in. And we were trying to basically decompose the racial wealth gap. How much of it is really structural and historical and embedded, and how much of it is a result of choices. We've heard a lot about that a little bit earlier. And basically the bottom line is that well over 80% of the racial wealth gap is embedded in historical. And no matter how many good choices people of color make, you're not really going to close the gap. And they did this by comparing Blacks and whites who made similar choices to see what effect that had on the gap. So we know it's mostly structural. So I'd like you first, Darrick, just to reflect a little bit more. We've heard some great comments already from the room. A little bit more about this framework of structure versus choices. I think about choices as making good choices, and I think about structures and institutions as about having good choices to make. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you're thinking about that?
Yeah, and the problem with going at lunch, I'm repeating some of the stuff that other people have said, but I'm going to try to say it in different words so it sounds original.
Well, you've done your own research on this too, Darrick.
I'll be a little
and that's what I'm referring
Thank
to.
You, Ray. Right. We have a great paper with Ann titled "Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain." Mm-hmm. So simply observing that people with a lot of wealth also have a lot of education, perhaps we have the causality wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? Perhaps it's the case that wealth itself puts people in a position generationally to have access to that high education, right? So we need to think about causality. To me, when we observe people making choices, and this work comes from people like Jonathan Murdoch, as well as Rachel, I might mispronounce her last name, Schneider, right? In their book, Financial Diaries, people know when they're engaging in predatory lending. The problem that their book demonstrated is that they didn't have choice. So when we observe people's choices and make assessments without noting the choices they had in the first place, we got it wrong. The causality is wrong. So it's more likely that not deficient decision-making, but poor resources itself leads to outcomes that we interpret as deficiency. That's the problem. I mean, we all can benefit from financial coaching. I'm an economist and I can't tell you where to invest resources. I don't know. But there are highly paid people that I have access to that can tell me and give me advice on how to invest resources. Right. So, because I think that's it. I think in a nutshell, and that to me is this economic rights framework. That to me is this framework of trying to, and let me say, because I'm trying to sell this. I'm trying to get everybody to come on board and believe in human rights. That's an easier sell, human rights, right? But the big problem with the human rights sell, however effective we have been at putting forth a narrative that people need political rights, civil rights, social rights, it's hardly contested in an enlightened group. The contestation comes in delivering on that, but we don't contest the idea. But what we also need to understand is that a pillar in human rights has to be economic rights. And I dare say that part of where we are right now is the result of a narrative that emphasizes freedom and choice in the framework of those rights that we've been describing, political, civil, social, devoid of economics, right? I argue that that's an illusion, and it's an attentional illusion. And why do you have that attentional illusion? Because the responsibility shifts from structures onto individuals. It is not structural. You can choose, you can get an education, you can vote, but without the economic rights portion of it, it is inadequate, it is illusionary, and it is misleading, and potentially intentional.
So this is a great segue to my next question, which is, so as the team in St. Louis and others have documented, we've had a large and enduring wealth gap. In the last 30, 40 years, there has been, in fact, progress on rights, right? Voting rights, civil rights, greater representation in Congress by people of color, enormous educational gains, right? Why is it, when we've had all these other gains, Darrick, that it's not changing the racial wealth gap? Why are those changes not translating into more wealth?
Yeah, I mean, that's the right question, Ray, because Black people have made tremendous relative gains in many dimensions. Mm-hmm. Perhaps education is the most pronounced one, mm-hmm. despite the rhetoric that Black people somehow don't like education. But the big thing is, with wealth, we need to understand how wealth is created. And again, the simple statement is that it is wealth that begets most wealth. You know, when we think about savings in the United States, the vast majority of Americans, only about 10% of Americans actually engage in active savings. And what do I mean by active savings? Money from your check that you don't consume. Most of the savings in America is passive for most of us, meaning you're in a vehicle that will passively appreciate over your life. And what are they? A home, a 401k account, an education that affords you a job that gives you a 401k account. You could be in a business, right? So these are mechanisms by which the Americans that do save, that's where most of the savings comes from, of that group. Well, what is the critical ingredient to get into one of those assets? Wealth. What did you need? What's the difference between a homeowner and a renter? A down payment. What is the difference between a worker with a great idea and an entrepreneur with a great idea? The capital to operationalize that great idea. Right.
Right. Very good. You know, this reminds me of a great comment from the last panel. Education is not the great equalizer. Wealth is the great equalizer. I love that. And in fact, as was mentioned earlier, we had our own research back at the Fed showing that, in fact, the racial wealth gap, as was mentioned, is actually creating the racial wealth gap, making the racial wealth gap worse. It's true that more education does lead to more wealth. However, it's the higher up you go, the greater the gap gets. So,
and Ray, real quick, there's something pernicious about that, right? I led with the story of my parents and everything. What we don't ask when we tell people to go to school, to better themselves and work hard, we don't ask at what cost. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to work twice as hard to get by the other person?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not telling you to not tell your child, and this happens across gender, across race, et cetera, even amongst white men. You will tell your child, work twice as hard to overcome your barriers. But the thing we don't ask is at what cost? What is the cost of putting in above normal effort, above normal ingenuity in order to overcome structural barriers? Stress, stigma, and it manifests in health outcomes. I'll give one quick statistic, which is we know that there's a mortality gap between Blacks and whites. Those born between the ages of 25 and 64, there's about a 50% greater mortality rate for Black people than white people. But what is pernicious and damning is that if we look amongst only those with a college degree, the gap goes to 75%. That's a problem. Effort, investment should not lead to greater disparity relative to your peers. That is a problem in a bad society.
Mm-hmm. Great. I have 20 more questions for Darrick, but I'm gonna, five of them came just from the previous panel, but I would like to open it up if anybody would like to ask a question. And since we don't have a lot of time, if you all could be brief and concise with your question, and I think I might even group them. So how many hands do I have up so far? 1, 2, 3, okay. 4, okay. Anybody we haven't heard from yet at all? Sir, would you like to go first? Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me get right to it. Why is there not any study that asks white Americans why they feel that Black Americans should be denied services, should have to work harder, should not have the same things that they have, and well, you get the point.
Yeah.
Is there some way, because I think if we understand what that motivation comes from, then you can really decide, well, what are we fighting here? Because I don't know what we're fighting because it's with all due respect, all of the reports and the studies, I love it, but there's people out there that are strategizing to get around everything that you have illuminated for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions in the very back of the room, please. Yes, with the glasses. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay, hi, Sheila Reinertsen from New Jersey Policy Perspective. I guess my question has to do with the forward progressive solutions, and that while striving for them, where is our defense mechanism to make sure that they survive the political pushback? So my neighbor has a bumper sticker that says, "The American dream is not a handout." And I think about that when ARP dollars had a program for Black farmers. And the pushback was so bad, they dropped the program. So how do we prepare for those firewalls to ensure these solutions survive what we know will be ugly pushback?
Thank you. I'll take one more question from the floor. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Thank you so much for your what you said so far. What's coming for me is when you talk about human rights, it's always that question of who determines that, in terms of who's human. And then also in terms of something that you said about the gentleman that spoke in reference to the strategies and who determines and how do we talk to white folks. I have a question for you in terms of how do we work towards making sure that people are more open to the conversation of how white community culture and white dominance is affecting all of us? How do we have that conversation around how we all become liberated? Because one of the things when we talk about my team and I is that no person is liberated because no one's ever lived in an equitable society. So even persons who are white skinned identity persons are not liberated. They think that they're better than others. So how do we work towards that effort, as well as close these gaps that you all are talking about? So this is phenomenal information. I'm just more interested in.
Okay, Darrick's going to give us some brief but compelling answers, and we might have room for a few more.
All right, and Ray, if I forget something, please give me a cue.
Sure.
So the issue of studies of white Americans' view on Black Americans, I'll say this, racism, discrimination, it's problematic if we think of it as simply a set of feelings that some individuals have towards other individuals. What I'm trying to offer is a structural explanation for which I didn't originate. You can look at sociologists like Herbert Blummer, where he described that race prejudice doesn't exist in a set of feelings per se, but rather relative status. So that becomes useful to understand why somebody will go to some of these structures. And here's the part I hope people get to is relative status has material consequences as well as psychological consequences. That's real. That's something that now, so let me start with that. That race gets weaponized from a structural standpoint. Don't forget about the individuals, whether Katie likes me or doesn't like me, et cetera, et cetera. The structures and incentives that exist in society that give identity group currency, that's the problem. And the currency that it gets is that in a transaction, all things equal, this has greater value. That's what we need to fight against. And there are solutions. The next thing, forward progressive solutions. I love this question. One, we need to start thinking about industrial policy different. People aren't just consumption agents, but rather they're productive agents. And industrial policy, government is always engaged in the strategic direction of resources and ways to promote the economy. So a lot of these programs that I'm talking about, they're not just subsistence programs. They're intended to promote people to be their best selves so that they can be innovative and ingenious in their work. And this is not pie in the sky. We can look to periods of like the New Deal, when America had some of its greatest growth, and that growth was done in a way that promoted shared prosperity. Well, that was a productive period of American history. We all know that Black people were excluded, and I don't mean to gloss over that in a lot of ways. But going forward, if we're putting forth policies, I would frame it as a human rights economy or investments in our most treasured resource, which are people and the environments that they live in, is the best pathway for not only a productive society, but a just society. So I think we need to reframe and understand what a lot of these policies mean. They're also automatic stabilizers. Imagine if we had guaranteed income in place when the pandemic hit. Imagine if we had a federal job guarantee in place. They would mitigate economic downturn recessions in an automatic way without having to go through the political process. So there are clear economic rewards to having a society structured in this way. What else do I want to say? Last question was, and I didn't go through the policies. I can talk about what they would be. Basically, economic rights, public options to banking. So that if you're going to have the private sector in banking, they have to offer at least this amount in order to engage in banking. Universal health insurance, single payer health insurance. These are, and then somebody also asked the question, who determines who gets these rights? These are inalienable rights for which, and that's a really good question. We need to be intentionally, and maybe I need to add the word inclusive human rights or inclusive economic rights, because in the past when we did them, we didn't do them in an inclusive way. So going forward, we need to make sure that by design, by management and implementation of these policies, that we are actively anti-racist and anti-sexist. They're universal, but actively structured in those ways. Then the last question was, I forgot. Oh, what was the last question? Lost track.
Yeah, did you want to repeat it very quickly?
Oh, that was the last question. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Really quick, the other thing I wanted to say about that is that, the question about how do we have sustainability in this framework and avoid some of the political backlash? History can give us some of those answers. What was the backlash to the New Deal? What was the backlash to the Great Society in the New Deal and civil rights? Well, we started to pathologize Black people. We started to make cases that these undeserving deadbeats and welfare queens are getting handouts from the government. So therefore, government engagement in our society is problematic. And there was also some Overton moments, so I don't want to oversimplify, like inflation generated from an oil crisis. But to a large extent, the backlash was to demonize Black people and shift political rhetoric in ways that moved us in new directions. So when I said that economics, politics, and identity group stratification are iterative and endogenously related to each other, having an inclusive economic framework mitigates the lure to fascism, mitigates as we become more desperate in inequality and unequal, it creates pathways for strong men or strong women to come along and argue that, one, it is these people that are affecting your way of life, and two, however unequal society is, at least you'll be better than them. And sadly, that has appeal. So I guess what I'm arguing is that a necessary ingredient for this just society are economic rights, are policies that empower all of us with at least a baseline. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary.
Looking at our timekeeper here.
Yeah, there are some more questions.
Gentleman that we heard from earlier, sir, do you have a question? In the very back? Okay.
Well, it's about iteration, and I love everything you're saying. So for a local region like Philly, where you have a lot of cities where the GDP is huge, and there are more options in the city going an hour out, thinking about this just society piece, I'm curious your thoughts on iteration and getting there for a place like Philly.
Yeah. And I need help. I don't know. Right. So, the short answer is that, we shouldn't wait on the federal government. The gold star is going to be the federal government because they have the capacity to make this sustainable. Right. Unfortunately, localities are literally constrained by their annual budgets in ways that the federal government isn't. So the North Star is the federal government for the United States. But how do we get there? Through demonstration, through competition. New York City just passed from the Racial Justice Commission 3 initiatives that I bet are going to have impacts on the rest of the country at some point, that I bet is going to shame Philly into trying to take up some of them as well. We're winning. No, I'm joking. And I'll mention those really quick. We changed the preamble of the New York Charter to put those values that we've been talking about today literally in the charter. And words have meaning, right? It doesn't have legal authority to make the city do this, but those words and that commitment to value is a narrative that will have longevity. We established a Racial Justice Commission and an Office of Racial Equity, which is charged with this as their purview in trying to redress in our city. And then finally, there's a True Cost of Living initiative, which also doesn't have legal authority, but guess what it's gonna do when New York City starts going beyond the poverty measure that's determined by the federal government and identifying the needs of its people, union bargaining. Imagine the impact that having the metric alone is gonna do on the capacity of people to politically organize and create the structures we want.
Our last comment, Coach, we can take it 3, and then we'll be ready.
Can somebody get a mic over
Tomorrow
there?
still creeps, leading us to dusty death surrender. I just wanted to say at this point is that as an elder, again, I only speak from lived experience. And 25 years ago, I had a discussion with one of the icons in your whole industry from the Philadelphia Reinvestment Fund. And I stood on the street, 31st and Street and Strawberry Mansion in the 1800s. And the icon had bragged about that was his neighborhood. He lived there. It was a flower shop. It was still a house there. And we had a discussion. And at that time, I reiterated part of my life history from the east side of Broad Street to 33rd Street. And every move we made, the first place that we were, we rented. Then we moved on the other side, we rented, and then we were able to buy. And then when I got to Strawberry Mansion, I was able to buy. And I mentioned to him that no one really addresses the elephants in the room. And I said, my parents and the people around us had followed the Jewish community from the east side of Broad Street all the way up through Strawberry Mansion.
I'm not going to have a Kanye moment.
No.
Sorry.
No.
That was a joke. I'm sorry, sir. I had to get it in.
It's about accountability. And I had mentioned that all the businesses and all the homes that we were able to we bought from his family and his relatives and his friends. And the stores that we bought, that they still controlled the distribution, how the stores were stocked and everything. So and the homes that we bought not knowing about redlining. And I had mentioned to them at that time is that someone somewhere down the line has to just be accountable. Just says, put your heart on the altar and just admit it and work against it. Is that we did not get the memo when my uncle had bought a home not far through the GI Bill that was being advertised in the Tribune and everything to come buy these houses and have no money down. But we didn't get the memo, but I'm sure his dad did. He knew because they were one of the realtors that we bought things from in the neighborhood. They knew about redlining. We did not get that. And so somewhere down the line that we have been developed or been groomed to be able to come behind you. And all the Jewish communities in the neighborhood, as I remember them, is that they were the only ones that we could buy from. We loved them for it. Still do. That's the only one that would work with us. But they knew what was in the, and they always had the ability to move as a group someplace else and continue to live. And until someone gets to the point that they can come back and be accountable, all the things that you still say, I still hear and I listen to you. And all the facts and the figures, and it's a cloud. And until you get to the point that you want to say that I want to throw the money, the dollars and the cents and everything at that problem and make it right, we're going to be wrong.
Thank you.
So I'll say that data and evidence is not enough, but data and evidence is valuable and useful. So the reason why Black people didn't benefit from the GI Bill was not a memo. There was active administration of a GI Bill in both Northern and Southern contexts, where the distribution of it was often at a local level that prevented Black people from benefiting from the GI Bill. This is...
It's not about the GI Bill, it's about redlining. The fact that we were
and you add on redlining.
We had no out.
You add on redlining, that accelerates the problem. It exponentially makes it worse, right? Ultimately, redlining wasn't about, there was simply this area that you don't move to. Redlining was, this was the only area that Black people could live in. That was the point. It wasn't about choice. It was about a structure that forced people into that area. So that's important to know. And then as it relates to immigrants in relation to Black people, and this is not limited to a Jewish Black comparison, but it is often the case that Black people get juxtaposed against another group and are asked, well, why don't they emulate the other group? It ignores the structure and resources by which immigration takes place to begin with. Immigration is a selective activity. It's not always easy to get to the United States. And when people come to the United States, it has been a pattern that people often replicate the class status from which they migrated from. So notions of Black people, of Jewish people coming to America with nothing, I would argue that's a fallacy. It was often a highly educated group that came, and that in and of itself was an asset. And again, it's not a story limited to Jewish people. This is an immigrant story. I just pointed that out, for example. So that's a point, and there was one other point I wanted to make. It's terrible I end on a note where my memory lapsed, but that's what happens when you get older. Senior.
Okay, Darrick, fabulous thoughts, a lot of insights. I wish we had more time. Please join me in thanking